And welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. This is Jesse Weber. We're going to jump in a little bit back to the Donald Hartung courtroom, but right now we want to focus on the Harvey Weinstein sex crimes trial out here in New York. Yesterday was an incredible day where we heard the testimony from Annabella Sciorra, probably the most well-known of the accusers to come forward during the course of this trial. She testified against Weinstein and said how he harassed, threatened, bullied, and violently raped her. I want to break it down right now with a very special guest. Louise Godbold is with us, and she as well is one of Harvey Weinstein's accusers. Thank you so much for coming here to talk about what we saw yesterday.
Thank you for having me here.
So I want to talk about her testimony. First, I'll just ask you your reaction to what you heard.
It was very upsetting hearing the details of the rape. I think Annabella is incredibly courageous. I know that it took a lot out of her, just even thinking about testifying, and you would not have known. On the stand, she was so composed, poised, almost regal, and she was very clear in her answers. Obviously had been well prepped, thank goodness. And I think she did an outstanding job.
Yeah, I mean, we were both there. She was on for 6 hours. So it's not easy. And also, you know, just the idea of everyone staring at you and going through this difficult testimony, not an easy thing to do. You know, when you were listening to her, look, she's called out to talk about her experience. The prosecution is bringing her to talk about, you know, a pattern and whether or not the jury will believe that Harvey Weinstein did this to multiple people. But the way she was describing, whether it was the stalking, the harassment, the actual rape, were there times that you were thinking, wow, that does sound like Harvey. Wow, that's a pattern of Harvey. That sounds like something that he's done before. And I'm curious, when you were listening to that, whether you picked up on certain things from her stories that you said, wow, that's just eerily familiar.
Well, of course. I mean, we are all variations on the same story, basically. Some of us were more fortunate than others and got away. So there is a common thread through all of these stories. Most of all, Harvey's persistence and his manipulation and the grooming part, which I don't think has been very much discussed. How charming Harvey was, how he made you feel like you had this huge potential, and how he recognized your talents and he wanted to promote you. And with Annabella was talking about, he wanted her to read some scripts, and that part of the story is that's germane to all of the stories, I think.
There was an equally disturbing part when she talked about the aftermath and how there was substance abuse and how she went into a depression. What did you think about that? Because that was really chilling, where she even described at one point cutting herself. She talked about smearing the blood on the wall, just trying to understand exactly what the effect of this was on her life. What did you make of all that?
Well, I'm also a trauma specialist. I run a nonprofit in Los Angeles, and we provide services to trauma survivors. So that is not unusual. Self-harm can look like many different things. Hers was very dramatic and very metaphorical, the blood being mixed in with the red of the paint on the wall. It was like she was wanting to paint her pain in a way that people could see it. But self-harm looks like driving drunk, picking fights, not going to doctor's appointments. It's fairly common, but from what I heard in her testimony and from what I know from friends of hers, she was devastated, lost a lot of weight and then gained a lot of weight. And these things are very indicative of the inner turmoil that she was going through. And that's the really disastrous part of trauma, is that it leaves a legacy in your body. And so to me, it is ridiculous that we have a statute of limitations on the crime, because the outcome of that, the impact of that, there is no limitation on that.
Well, from a prosecution's point of view, it's tough because it's so many years ago. Are there witnesses, are there surveillance tapes, and that's a separate issue in terms of prosecuting it, but this jury did say that they would be open to convict purely based on witness testimony. Talking about trauma, going into what was talked about by the defense, but what's also equally important today is we're having the testimony of Dr. Barbara Ziv, The state is calling this witness to kind of dispel these rape myths. And one of the things that Annabella was ultimately questioned about was why she didn't report it. Why didn't she go to the hospital? Why didn't she go to the doorman and ask, how could you let Harvey Weinstein upstairs? What are your thoughts on that line of questioning?
Well, look, if you've been run over and you're lying dazed in the street, are you thinking about, oh gosh, I should call my insurance? Oh gosh, I need to go and have a checkup with my doctor. Of course, all those things are important, but in the moment, that's not what you're thinking about. You are in survival brain, which means you're in the primitive part of your brain that's only looking after one thing, which is your survival. And the higher part of your brain, the analytical thinking part of your brain, is actually not online. So again, it's not at all strange to me that she wouldn't have done those things.
If you can explain to our audience, a week later, 2 weeks later, which is what she was pressed on. How come she didn't speak to anyone about this for years? Family, friends, and that's the question that the prosecution needs to have answered in order to explain to this jury, you might have a belief about everybody's going to report it eventually or everybody will speak about it eventually, but that's not the case. Why is that not the case?
Well, I think she did tell Rosie Perez.
Right,
initially.
She did tell Rosie Perez, and Rosie Perez, I believe, will be called as a witness
right.
to talk about that. But aside from Rosie Perez and maybe one other individual that was mentioned yesterday, that level of coming forward and telling her story, that was something that was pressed upon by the defense. And why is that the case?
Again, if you can put yourself in the shoes of a sexual assault survivor, it is the most intimate attack. And it is something that fills you with shame. And that's not fair because it's not your shame, it's the perpetrator's shame. But there's a lot of shame around it. And it's a lot easier to say, oh, I got my bag snatched, and everyone will be very sympathetic. But when you say, I was the victim of a sexual assault, then all the questions come up, like, well, why did you let him in? Or what were you wearing? And so there's a lot of shame, and this is why survivors do not come forward. And so it's hardly surprising. And it's also fairly common that people do not report. So I don't think she should be judged for that. I mean, she was behaving like very many survivors too. I mean, I told the person who was waiting for me, because obviously I came out of Harvey's hotel suite totally discombobulated, and he knew something was wrong. But I didn't tell very many other people in my life, especially my family, especially my mother. I wouldn't want to upset her. I wanted to put it all behind me, and I'm sure that Annabella felt the same way.
A lot of the discussion in the opening statements was about these enablers, and we also heard it a little bit yesterday, these people who allegedly assisted Harvey Weinstein in helping him do what he is accused of doing. Can you speak about that? Because whether it was the driver of the car, whether it was one individual who allegedly locked one of these women in the bathroom with Harvey Weinstein, whether it was an assistant who helped put the pieces in motion, what can you speak about that?
Just even thinking about it makes me see red. And it's not as if these are historical enablers. You were at the courtroom, you saw his posse, you saw those people. He's still surrounded by enablers, which we now know, the world knows, I always knew, but the world knows who this man is. And the fact that people are still toadying up to him is disgraceful. But I hope that all the people who surrounded him in the past will begin to understand the ramifications, the consequences of supporting this man. And I hope it's going to be scorched earth around him, that people will no longer want to go near him or touch him.
And I understand that you were in the courtroom for the cross-examination by Donna Rotuno. What's your opinion of how she cross-examined Annabella Sciorra?
Well, I thought it was very interesting. Did you notice how she'd have a great long question crammed with all kinds of facts and details, and at the end of it she'd say, correct? Which is really trying to elicit a yes or no answer. But fortunately, Annabella had been well prepared, and so she would unpack it again and say, yes, I did say that to that person, but I didn't say those words, and I'm not sure when I said it. So she was very careful in her response. And I think we saw Donna Rotunno get a little bit agitated. And the fact that Annabella was so calm, I think actually showed Donna Rotunno in a bad light, because you could see she was getting a little frustrated. Did you think that?
Well, you know, look, she's a defense attorney, and she's trying to make a point to this jury, whether the point is to show that the story is unbelievable or the way that Annabella Sciorra described the story should not be believed. She's also selling something to the jury. We can't forget that. She's a defense attorney, and her client does have a right to representation, so the way she handles that is interesting. It was apparent, particularly one part where I did believe that Donna Rotunno was surprised was when Annabella Sciorra seemed to suggest that she didn't know the difference between criminal law and civil law, and Donna Rotunno seemed to be was flustered by that fact, or said, "How is that possible? You know, and we saw this back and forth. It was between them for quite some time. I believe the cross-examination was 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. There was an interesting part. I know we're running low on time, but I want to ask you, it's more of a general question that we saw from the defense. Because as I was listening to this story, and if you're believing the defense's narrative that these women are making this up and that it's not true, the question is why? And the defense seemed to suggest in their opening statement that women are coming forward, recharacterizing what happened with them with Harvey Weinstein in order to fit the narrative of 2017 or 2020, that they want to be a part of a movement, that they maybe are ashamed that they had a consensual relationship with Harvey Weinstein and it's different now and they don't want to come forward. That was their argument in their opening statement and what they're going to continue to make throughout this trial. What's your thoughts on that?
It's true that we do live in different times. And the implication of that is we can now talk about sexual assault and we can name it for what it was. I think that that is the real change. And I am one of the victims. And so it's so hard, because when I'm asked that question, it's not hypothetical. It's not an allegation. It's truth. I can tell you it's truth. And I'm proud of all the women who've come forward and have the backing of the Me Too movement to be able to say, this happened to me, it was not right, I don't want it to happen to anyone else, and so I'm going to speak up.
Louise, are you going to come back to the trial when the other women testify?
I hope so, yes.
And will you be there on the day of the verdict?
I very much hope so. I mean, I'm running a small nonprofit, so I can't spend too much time away, but I'll book a seat next to you.
Please do. Well, unfortunately, the courtroom is so strict that they wouldn't allow you next to me. I mean, that whole scene. I'll ask you one more final question. What did you make of the scene of the courtroom? Because it's so packed. I mean, the reporters are only designated to a certain spot. No cell phones are allowed. It's quite the scene. What was your take on being there?
Well, that's why I want a seat next to you, because I was sitting on the corridor floor for 5 hours. Thank goodness I was wearing jeans, because we couldn't get in.
Yeah.
And I think that is disgraceful. I mean, God bless the press for covering this, but 7 rows for the press and 2 rows for the public, and having to get there at 5:30 in the morning to try and even get into the courtroom, and then not succeeding. I think that's a great shame, because especially for the survivors, this is our lives. This happened to us, and it's been very much part of our lives the last 2 years.
It is surprising that they didn't seem to prepare more for this. There's no overflow room where everybody else can wait. They've come up with a system where it's a numbered system. You know, you get an index card, you can get back in. I don't know if it's going to change, probably not. But I'm glad you were there. I hope to see you for the rest of the trial or as it unfolds. And I appreciate you coming on to give your perspective on everything that's happened so far.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everybody, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll have more.